All right, so now moving on to chapter 23, which is all about parasites. Collectively, parasites include protozoa, helminths, and the ectoparasites, which would be the insects that can transmit disease. Now, altogether, parasitic infections cause about 1/5 of all known infectious diseases, and it seems that statistically they are less prevalent in industrialized countries and also increasingly more common in late-stage AIDS patients or the third stage of clinical HIV infection. Now, with regards to protozoa, it's important to remember that there are two potential life cycle stages of this type of organism. So it can exist in the active feeding stage. This would be called the trophozoite stage, or it may undergo the formation of a cyst. This is analogous to an endospore in bacteria, so it's a dormant cell type, but it still can be transmitted from one host to another and then activated as a trophozoite. For example, if you swallow or ingest an infective cyst, it then could transition back to this trophozoite active feeding stage in the digestive tract. Now, protozoa are single-celled organisms, and most of them have some form of motility. There's about 25 that are important, medically significant pathogens. So we will talk about the most significant ones for this chapter. What's really interesting is that for some of these organisms, they may potentially have asexual and also sexual stages of reproduction. If it's the sexual form, it's referred to as conjugation. So the ones that we'll mention are in this table here. So Entamoeba histolytica, Naegleria, Balantidium coli, Giardia, Trichomonas, Trypanosoma, Leishmania, Plasmodium, Toxoplasma, Cryptosporidium. Those are all the most important pathogenic protozoa. So starting off with Entamoeba histolytica, this is the causative agent of amoebiasis, and this has the potential to form both the trophozoite and the cyst stage. The trophozoite form has a large nucleus and lacks most other known organelles, and humans are indeed the primary hosts for this organism. They are transmitted by ingesting the microbe, and it's actually carried by 10% of the world's population. So if you see here, it's the cyst that's ingested. The cyst will pass through the stomach, and this will activate the digestive juices, will activate the cyst to transition to the trophozoite stage. The trophozoite is released in the small intestine. They then will encyst in the large intestine, and they are released as cysts in the form of fecal matter, which then can go on to be transmitted to a different host. So this is actually just a cartoon image showing you the transformation from the cyst form, again it's the dormant cell type, to the active feeding stage. So the cysts, like we just said, they are ingested, and it's the digestive juices that will stimulate the cyst to release on average 4 trophozoites. The trophozoites will then attach, multiply, actively move about, and feed, and believe it or not, 90% of people do not have symptoms. So again, it's carried by about 10% of the world's population. The amoeba may then secrete enzymes that will cause tissue destruction, may also penetrate deeper layers of the mucosal lining within the digestive tract, causing all of these GI-related symptoms: dysentery, pain, fever, diarrhea, and associated weight loss. Now, there are life-threatening manifestations of this: bleeding, appendicitis, also amoebomas, so these are tumor-like growths, also may spread to the liver and the lungs, so this is in rare cases, but it's actually severe forms result in 10% fatality rate, which is less common, but there are known drugs that are effective to treat this particular parasitic infection. Now, there's also some amoebas that not only can infect the digestive tract and spread to other organs, but may additionally infect the brain. So Naegleria fowleri and acanthamoeba. So these would be found in fresh standing water. And when you ingest the water, this can actually spread to, if the water contains this amoeba, it can enter the nasal passages and travel to the brain, causing primary acute meningoencephalitis. So this would be acquired through nasal contact, or also traumatic eye damage. And once it infiltrates to the brain, this is usually fatal. And there actually have been a few cases of this right here in Connecticut. Now, another medically significant parasite is Balantidium coli. This is an occupant of the intestines of pigs and cattle. And again, another one that's acquired by actually ingesting the cyst, and this would be in contaminated food or water. So same thing, swallowing the cyst, which then will transition to the trophozoite, infecting the intestine and causing the associated GI intestinal symptoms. Usually people who have a healthy immune system are resistant, so people who are immunocompromised, young or very old, are more susceptible, and it rarely will penetrate through the intestine or enter the bloodstream, and there is a group of or set of drugs that are effective for treating this particular infection. Here's a picture of the trophozoite on the bottom of this slide. This is the cartoon image of trophozoite and the cyst on the right. We also have a parasite that can be spread via sexual contact. So Trichomonas vaginalis causes a common STD known as trichomoniasis. It is small, pear-shaped under the scope, and these cells have many flagella and also this undulating associated membrane. And it's good to remember they exist only in the active form, so only in the trophozoite form and not the cyst. So here it's characteristic for flagella and this exterior additional membrane that is used for movement. Now, Trichomonas vaginalis, and this is a real electron micrograph using a compound light microscope, causes this STD called trichomoniasis. 50% of infected individuals do not show symptoms, and there's actually 3 million documented cases yearly, so it is a top STD. There is a drug available, and as far as the symptoms that are seen, in females, foul-smelling green to yellow discharge, also inflammation and infection of the vulva and the cervix, urinary frequency and pain in males, inflammation as well, and an associated discharge, and even infection of the prostate. Additionally, we have another parasitic protozoan that can cause disease in humans, and that is Giardia lamblia. This causes giardiasis. Another one that has flagella, and it has this unique symmetrical heart shape structure of the cell, and it can form both the trophozoites and cysts. And usually the cyst forms have multiple nuclei. As far as the reservoirs, not only humans, but also beavers, cattle, coyotes, even cats. And these cysts are pretty hardy, so they can survive for 2 months in the local environment, usually contracted or transmitted from contaminated food or water, and you need to swallow around 10 to 100 cysts in order for them to become infective. So this is again another cartoon image here. Usually the cyst form of this is smaller than the trophozoite. And this is one that if you guys watch the Parasites Eating Us Alive video, that the narrator mentioned, that this one under the microscope, usually scientists or microbiologists refer to this as being the cute one, the cute pathogenic protozoan, because it has this, what looks like a little face, right? So there's multiple nuclei and what looks like a nose and a mouth, because they are symmetrical in shape. So in order to become infected with this particular parasite, the cyst is ingested, it enters the duodenum, germinates, and then will travel to the jejunum to feed and multiply, and then it causes the associated diarrhea, abdominal pain. The thing with this particular infectious disease is that it is difficult to diagnose because it can lie dormant in the sense that the cyst will not be shed in the feces consistently, so it will require potentially follow-up tests. As far as treatments, there are drugs available, and this particular pathogen can be killed by boiling. So if we're talking about contaminated water or food, it is killed by heating, also ozone and iodine as well. Now moving on to the group known as the hemoflagellates. These are the vector-borne blood parasites. So the term vector is referring to an insect. And the hemoflagellates, generally, these are obligate parasites that will live in blood and also tissues of a human host. And for the most part, they cause a lot of life-threatening and debilitating zoonotic diseases. So again, zoonotic spread via an animal. And also, we see generally these diseases associated with tropical regions of the world. And they're spread via blood-sucking insects that can serve as intermediate hosts. So they just pass the pathogen from one host to another. A lot of the hemoflagellates have these complicated life cycles, so they have multiple stages of their life cycle and different structural names associated with those stages. So they're categorized according to their cellular morphological status and also their infective stage as well. So for example here, Leishmania, Trypanosoma brucei, and Trypanosoma cruzi, they will evolve from the amastigote to the promastigote, to the epimastigote, and then the trypomastigote. And only one of these is the infective stage for each. So for Leishmania, the promastigote is the infective stage. And this is the one that is found in the sandfly gut. So it is transmitted via a sandfly. For Trypanosoma brucei, it's the trypomastigote that is infective to humans, and this is spread via the tsetse fly. For Trypanosoma cruzi, again, it's the trypomastigote that is transmitted to humans from the feces of the reduvid bug, or common name kissing bug. So Trypanosoma species causes trypanosomiasis, and there's two types here. There's Trypanosoma brucei, which causes African sleeping sickness, and Trypanosoma cruzi, which causes Chagas disease. And this is endemic to Central and South America. So there's a picture here of the infective form. Again, the trypomastigote in a blood smear. Trypanosoma brucei is the causative agent of African sleeping sickness, and it is spread via the tsetse fly. And also it is harbored by reservoir mammals. There's two subspecies, so Gambiense, which is in West Africa, and Rhodesians, which is in East Africa. And so the fly will inoculate the skin with the trypomastigote, that's the infective stage, which then will multiply in the blood, and it can target multiple organs, the spleen, lymph nodes, and also the brain. So because it's targeting, and this is a picture of the tsetse fly, because it's targeting the brain, it causes sleep disturbances, tremors, paralysis, and potentially coma. And you can find the trypanosomes in blood, spinal fluid, or also the lymph nodes. So before it actually spreads to the brain, it's very important to treat it at that stage. There are drugs available, and the only way to really get rid of this disease is to eliminate the vector that is spreading it. So eliminate the tsetse fly. Now here is showing you a picture of demographically where we see regions that are more prone to the pathogen and cases of the pathogen. So again, we said that Gambiense was more Western Africa, and Rhodesiense is Eastern Africa. And so I would remember here that it's spread via the tsetse fly, infective into the bloodstream, the trypomastigote, and then it can spread to the lymph nodes and to the brain. So the saliva of the fly that's infected with Trypanosoma brucei inoculates the human bloodstream. It will mature and invade various organs, and then leading to central nervous system damage. Now, the trypanosome also is spread to other hosts through another fly whose alimentary or digestive tract will complete a series of the developmental stages. So it actually requires the fly to cycle through its different stages of life. Now, moving on to another species of the Trypanosoma genus. Trypanosoma cruzi causes Chagas disease, and this is, unlike brucei, which is spread via the tsetse fly, cruzi is spread via the reduvid bug. And so the infection will occur when the bug feces is inoculated into the bite wound. So it's inoculated into a cutaneous portal, and this will cause a local inflammation around the bite, fever, swelling of lymph nodes, spleen, also liver. And you can find the amastigotes in the heart and the large intestine in the infected individual. This will lead to inflammation of the heart and the brain, and there are drugs available to treat this. So this is like brucei. We saw that it had its infective cycle. Same with cruzi. This is actually other animals that are part of the cycle, involve cats, even armadillos, and other wild animals that can perpetuate the life cycle of this pathogen. Moving on to Leishmania. Leishmania species cause the disease known as leishmaniasis, and it's associated with this characteristic Baghdad boil or ulcerated sore. So it's a zoonotic disease transmitted among mammalian hosts, and it's transmitted via another vector, the sandfly. It's typically endemic to equatorial regions, and it's the promastigote that's injected with the sandfly bite. The promastigotes are then converted to amastigotes. They will multiply, and if in the area the macrophages are around, the infection is localized. If the macrophages or these specialized white blood cells move, then it can become a systemic disease. So this is just a cartoon image here showing you, again, a life cycle here of this particular parasite. So the promastigote will carry out its life cycle in the gut of the sandfly, then being transmitted to humans and other animal hosts. They free in the intracellular, and mastigotes will then replicate within a macrophage and can lie local or systemic, and then further being spread from a bite associated with a sandfly. So that sore that you saw in the picture, another name for it, I said, was Baghdad boil. So this is this localized ulcerated sore. Another associated symptom called espunda, skin and mucous membrane infection of the head, and this usually causes a chronic infection. or systemic and visceral symptoms, which would be high intermittent fever, weight loss, enlarged spleen, liver, and also lymph nodes. And Kala-Azar is the most severe and fatal form if left untreated. All right, so and then we have the apicomplexan parasites that alternate between sexual and asexual phases, and also, interestingly, have these very complex life cycles because they seem to transition between a multitude of different animal hosts, and they can be infective via being transmitted by either arthropod vectors, food, water, or other means. So the three that I will focus on are Plasmodium, Toxoplasma, and Cryptosporidium. So Plasmodium is the genus associated with causing a troubling disease that we still see 2 million deaths each year. There's 300 to 500 million new cases each year, and we really don't have great drugs available for this disease. So we've resorted to using some of the arcane drugs like quinine to treat these diseases because people seem to have a lot of nasty side effects with current drug treatments. And the only way to really eradicate this disease, similar to any disease that's spread via an insect, is to get rid of the vector that's spreading it. So the female Anopheles mosquito is the primary vector. This actually also can be spread via blood transfusions and from mother to fetus transplacentally. There's 4 species: Plasmodium malariae, Plasmodium vivax, Plasmodium falciparum, and ovale. And it's good to know there's 2 distinct phases of development. So asexual and sexual, and the asexual occurs in the human host, whereas the sexual phase occurs in the mosquito. So once the human is infected with the asexual sporozoite, it then travels to the liver, and it will form what's called merozoites, which then will travel into the bloodstream. So once the merocytes are into the blood, they will then convert to the trophozoite and multiply, causing the red blood cells to lyse or to burst, releasing more merocytes that then differentiate into gametes. And so in the mosquito will draw the infected blood from the host. The gametes will fertilize, and this will then form the sporozoite in the stomach of the mosquito. The sporozoite lodges in the salivary glands of the mosquito, and then it's the sporozoite that is infective to the human host. So this is kind of the life cycle in a nutshell here. Again, sexual phase is occurring within the mosquito. The asexual phase is occurring within the human host. And it's good to remember here that it's infective in humans to the liver and also the red blood cells. Now, as far as the associated symptoms, episodes of chills, fever, sweating, anemia, and swelling of the organs, usually 2 to 3 days after you have been bitten. And it's usually at these intervals, actually, 3 days at a time, as the red blood cells rupture and new red blood cells are replenished. It also may vary a little bit slightly on the animal host, but falciparum is the most malignant type, so it's associated with the highest death rate in children. And you can actually just take a blood smear and look for the presence of the trophozoite infecting the red blood cells. And like I mentioned before, we really do not have great drugs available to treat this disease. So we're seeing a lot of drug-resistant forms of Plasmodium, or just more stubborn forms of the parasite. Moving on to Toxoplasma gondii, or causative agent of toxoplasmosis. So this is the parasite that can cause, if ingested, and if a pregnant woman is infected, can cause stillbirth to the fetus. So this is why it is advised that pregnant women stay away from cat litter. So Toxoplasma gondii is an apicomplexan parasite, and it lives naturally in cats that will contain the oocyst in their GI tract, and they will acquire this parasite from a rodent host. So the rodent host will actually be attracted to the cat will consume that rodent host and then possess the oocytes, which can be transmitted by ingesting meats or substances contaminated by cat feces. And a lot of cases of toxoplasmosis go unnoticed, except for in the case of fetal infection and also AIDS patients who seem to suffer brain and heart damage. There are drugs available, but again, it's usually difficult to diagnose. A lot of times people do not have specific symptoms. So this is the stage of the cat contracting the pathogen from the rodent, and then the human consuming the cyst form from cat fecal material that's contaminated. And also it can cycle through other animal hosts as well. So oocysts in the environment from cows, for example, can also be transmitted to humans. So this would be contaminated meat. Now, Sarcocystis is another parasite that causes sarcocystosis. So this is a parasite of cattle, swine, and sheep, and it seems that these animals are the intermediate hosts. So they pick up these cysts while grazing on grass that is contaminated with human feces, and then humans can become infected when we consume the meat that's contaminated with Sarcocystis. GI symptoms, diarrhea, nausea, and abdominal pain. There's no real treatment, so hopefully recovery after a week or so. Now, Cryptosporidium is on the list of a newly emerging infectious disease. It infects a variety of mammals, birds, and reptiles, and there's this notorious outbreak which was covered in the video from a couple weeks ago in the 1990s. 370,000 cases in Milwaukee and a bunch of associated deaths. And what happens here is when you ingest the oocyst form, it will transition into the sporozoite form that will infect the intestinal wall, causing gastroenteritis, headache, sweating, vomiting, cramps, diarrhea, and especially in late-stage HIV or AIDS patients, they may have chronic persistent diarrhea. So this is more of a common parasitic infection that we see in these patients, and it is debilitating. It's highly dehydrating for these patients. There's really no effective drugs, so you just have to wait it out until your body rids itself of this pathogen. We also have Babsia, which causes babesiosis, and this was actually historically the first protozoan to be found to cause a disease, specifically in cattle, and also the first protozoan to be associated with a vector. So it spread via a tick. It is relatively rare, but also involved in the life cycle are rodents, and some of the symptoms are very similar to what we see in malaria. So moving on to the helminths. So helminths are worms that you can actually see with the unaided eye, but we're talking about them in micro because they have these microscopic life cycles. So they cycle between an egg, a larva, and then the adult form. So the adult worms will mate and produce eggs that then hatch into larvae and then transition to adults. So these are actual multicellular animals that have these specialized tissues and organ systems. So they have a primitive nervous system. They have a primitive digestive tract and a sensory system. Now, the adult worms will live in what is called the definitive host, whereas the eggs and larvae may develop in the same host. The external environment of the intermediate host is where the eggs and the larvae reside, and the transport host experiences no development, so no evolution of a particular life cycle. And there's 4 basic patterns of the way that we see the infectious course occur and how it's transmitted. So these would be based on whether you're ingesting it through contaminated food or water, or whether it has been introduced into your skin through larvae, for example, that can penetrate through the skin. So that would be in the case of schistosomes. Now, just generally, helminths cause disease in a parasitic way. The worms will feed on and migrate through animal and human tissues, and it is the accumulation of the worm itself and also the worm products that cause the symptoms. So in order to diagnose these diseases, it's based on looking for signs, changes in the blood cell count, also serological tests to actually look for the eggs, the larvae, or even the worms in a fecal sample, or you may even see these forms in sputum, urine, blood, or tissue biopsies. So how do we treat these types of infections? An anti-helminthic drug will either inhibit the worm's movement, prevent it from holding a position, inhibit its metabolism, and usually they act locally in the intestine. Sometimes drugs are prescribed that will just make the worm move in a direction opposite from that drug. So if the worms are infecting the lungs, they may be coming out of that individual or that animal's mouth. So the idea is if it's not targeting the actual worm itself, it's driving it out of the body. So what are some examples of these parasites? So roundworms. There are 50 species that affect humans, and the ones that I will mention are the following: Ascaris, Trichuris, and Enterobius, which is one of the most common, strongyloids, trichinella, and filarial worms, and also hookworms. So Ascaris is a large roundworm. We see a lot of cases of these infections in the southeastern states. And Ascaris spends both its larval and adult stages in humans. It will then release eggs in fecal matter and then can be spread via contaminated food, drink, or objects. And once you consume the egg, it will hatch into the larva and burrow through your intestinal tract, travel to the lungs, where then you will cough them up and re-swallow them, and then back down into the gut. And the cycle continues. The adult worms complete the cycle in the intestines and reproduce around 200,000 eggs per day. So this is what the adult worm looks like. And they actually will not attach, but severe inflammatory reactions mark the movement or the migratory route. Also allergic reactions can occur, and it has been noted that heavy worm loads can retard physical and mental development. We also have whipworm or Trichuris trichura infection. Trichuriasis has the highest incidence in the tropics. And again, the eggs will hatch in the intestines. The larvae, in this case, though, attach and then develop into the adults. And here we see the worms can actually pierce the capillaries, cause local internal bleeding, and this can cause people to go septic. So this will allow the bacteria to leave the intestine, and heavy infestations also can cause dysentery and rectal prolapse. So a lot of times this is fatal in young ones. Now, Enterobius vernicularis is the common name here is pinworm or seatworm, and this is actually one of the more common parasitic infections, especially in children. So the eggs are picked up from the surroundings and swallowed, and they will hatch in the small intestine where they will develop into adults. And the characteristic symptom here is anal itching when the mature females emerge from the intestines to release eggs. And the notorious tape test will tell if an individual is infected, and usually self-inoculation is seen with this infection. Now also hookworms. So these have these characteristic hooked mouths. And the humans, once they're infected, will shed eggs in the fecal matter, which then hatch into larvae and burrow into the skin. So these are the ones that can burrow through the skin of the lower legs. They will travel from the blood to the lungs, proceed up to the throat, and swallowed. And the worms mature and reproduce in the small intestine to complete the cycle. So hookworm infection may cause not only pneumonia, but nausea, vomiting, cramps, and bloody diarrhea. Because of this, blood loss is significant, and usually hookworm infection is associated with anemia. So this is a picture, just a cartoon image here of the female and male hookworm, and then on the right here, so you see the characteristic hooks at the mouth. These are real electron compound light micrograph images. We also have Strongyloids stercoralis, which causes strongyloidiasis. These guys are tiny roundworms, and their life cycle is completed in humans or moist soil. So it's the larval form that will penetrate through the skin, move to the lungs, and then the worm is swallowed and will complete its development in the intestine. Heavy worm loads can cause lung inflammation, eosinophilia, bloody diarrhea, liver enlargement, bowel obstruction, and also malabsorption. Next is Trichinella spiralis, which causes trichinosis, and this is contracted when ingesting undercooked pork, or for anyone who likes bear meat. This also could contain the parasite in the larval form. So the larva will migrate from the intestines to the blood vessels, muscle, heart, brain, where it forms cysts. And there's kind of two noted set of symptoms here. The first set includes flu-like symptoms and diarrhea, and then this progresses to a second set of symptoms: muscle and joint pain, shortness of breath, and pronounced eosinophilia. There's no cure after the larva has been encysted. So this is kind of the rundown here. So the larvae encysted in pork, for example, are the ones in the infective stage. When ingested, the cysts will hatch and mature in the intestinal lining. The adults reproduce and form new larvae. These will burrow through the intestines and then enter the circulation, and they will form cysts in skeletal muscle that remain there for years. So this is one that's a nasty infection that thankfully is very rare, but there's really no cure or any good treatment for this disease. Now moving on to a different group of helminths, the nematodes. So these guys complete their life cycle in blood, the lymphatic system, or the skin. And the filarial worms, which were covered in the video, these were the ones that caused that deforming disease, the swelling of the extremities, and that was because of the parasite blocking the lymphatic system. These are spread via insects, so via biting arthropods, and they are associated with these chronic deforming diseases. So causative agent of elephantiasis, river blindness, and also the loa loa, or the eye worm. So Wucheria bancrofti causes Bancroftian filariasis, and this is a tropical infection which is spread specifically via mosquitoes. So the vector will deposit the larva, which will move into the lymphatic and then develop into the adults, where it will block lymphatic circulation, causing elephantiasis, which is that massive swelling in the extremities. Also, the causative agent of river blindness are onchocerciasis, Onchocerca volvulus. This is transmitted via black flies, and the larvae develop into adults in the subcutaneous tissues. The adult females will migrate from the blood to the eyes, provoking inflammatory reactions. And also, it seems to be the case that co-infection with Onchocerca and Wolbachia bacteria can cause the extent of river blindness, so kind of the worst case scenario. There are treatments here, tetracycline for the bacteria and ivermectin to treat the Onchocerca infection. Also, Loa loa, common name, the African eyeworm. This is also spread via a vector, a small fly, and in this case, the temperature-sensitive worm migrates around and under the skin and may enter the eye, and this is one where you saw in the video pulling the worm from a small hole, but in this case from the eye. The conjunctiva can be treated with an anti-helminth drug. Also, some flukes or trematodes that cause disease, so they are flatworms. They have their own digestive, excretory, neuromuscular, and reproductive systems, but they lack circulatory and respiratory systems. Usually snails or fish are the intermediate hosts, and humans are the definitive hosts. So there are blood flukes, or the schistosomes. These guys exhibit this curious reproductive capacity here and characteristic whereby the female worm lives inside the male worm, and there's a few different species associated with causing disease. The larva will penetrate human skin and move into the liver to mature, and then the adult worm migrates to the intestine or bladder and sheds eggs, giving rise to chronic organ enlargement. And this is one that seems to cycle through snails. Also, liver and lung flukes. So liver flukes, Clinorchus, for example, again cycles through snails and fish, and humans become infected when eating inadequately cooked fish. Also, Fasciola hepatica cycles between herbivores, snails, and even plants. Humans are infected by eating the raw aquatic plants. The fluke will lodge in the liver. So, also the lung fluke, Paragonimus westermanni. This cycles between carnivorous animals, snails, and crustaceans, and you can become infected by eating undercooked crustaceans. The intestinal worms will migrate to the lungs in this case. And then we have the tapeworms. So tapeworms are segmented flatworms, and each segment is called a proglottid. Each proglottid is an independent unit adapted to absorbing food and making and releasing eggs that then can go on to grow into the adult worm. So there's two different types, Saginata and Solium. Saginata is the beef tapeworm, so this is very large, up to 2,000 proglottids, and animals become infected by grazing on land contaminated with human feces, and we become infected by eating raw beef, in which the larval form has encysted. So that larva will attach to the small intestine, grow into the worm, and few symptoms, vague abdominal pain, nausea, but the proglottids are shed in the feces. Also, the pork tapeworm. This infects humans through ingesting cysts or eggs. The eggs hatch in the intestines, release the tapeworm larvae that migrate to all tissues and encyst. And these are most damaging if they lodge in the heart, muscle, eye, or brain, which may cause seizures and or psychiatric disturbances. And then lastly, the arthropod. So I would remember an arthropod is an insect that has an exoskeleton and jointed legs, and many of these feed on blood and tissue fluid of hosts during their life cycle. So these are the ectoparasites, and those of medical importance are the ones that transmit pathogens in the process of feeding. So there's actually part of the life cycle within the insect. So they're termed biological vectors. And examples of these would be mosquitoes. So we saw malaria was transmitted that way, filariasis, also fleas. So these have spread the plague, murine typhus. Lice have spread typhus as well, and relapsing fever. Flies, the tsetse fly and the sandfly we saw with trypanosoma diseases. Also ticks. So these guys we know transmit even diseases here in Connecticut, borrelial, which would be Lyme's disease, also viral diseases, other bacterial diseases, anaplasmosis or rickettsial. And there's a difference between the hard and the soft tick. For soft ticks, they can transmit relapsing fever. So those are all of the arthropods that can transmit disease, and again, they're termed ectoparasites, and that concludes chapter 23, which is all about parasites. So next week, we will move on to chapters 11 and 12. So see you all next week.